Well, the First World War didn't end up being the war to end all wars. For within 20 years, the world was back at it again until the mid-1940s, whereupon the world began a process of unprecedented consumption, and some refer to it perhaps as slaughter. We pick up part 3 with the Second World War that has seen the rise of the National Socialist Party through the 1930s, led by Adolf Hitler, and precipitated the Nazi movement and expansionism throughout Europe at the same time as expansionists' ambitions in Japan had coincided and led to major conflict in Eastern Asia as well. The war absolutely devastated Europe and left the countries in tatters. The war ended with the horrific dropping of the atomic bomb on both Hiroshima and Nagasaki in Japan. And for Sybil and Walter, there was ruin everywhere. Perhaps a new life awaited them someplace else. And that search to escape the ruins of Europe and seek out a new life led them eventually to the west coast of Canada, to Vancouver Island and a town called Campbell River, where they purchased a small home on the seaside and became, for Sybil, as she described it, forever a little piece of England. And life in Campbell River was a far cry from the ruins or even the upbringing of what Sybil had experienced in England. Campbell River on Vancouver Island was perhaps a rough and tumble kind of working man's place, early development of very much a logging center, very much a fishing center, a very strong, rich First Nations history in the area. And we're looking at some photos, just a selection of things from the museum at Campbell River's archives, just showing kind of the character of the times and kind of the sort of rural lifestyle of a place like Campbell River. And Sybil continued to work on linocut prints, but as we'll see, also a great deal of attention paid to woodcuts and drawings and watercolors that we'll explore a little further on. But just to look back at the giant cable of 1931 with her interest in the working man and labor, with reduced human form and diagonal compositions and a strong sense of the play between positive and negative space. Sybil very much continues this kind of thematic work and also formal construction of her works in Campbell River, as we're looking in the bottom right of a work from 1952 entitled Logging Team. And we see a kind of a cross-section of a diagonal meeting in the middle. Again, a very strong sense of force and kind of brute machinery against the very elemental logs in a very brown and yellow reduced landscape. We see, again, Sybil's curve, love of the curve, and just the depiction of the strength of industrial work now being translated from the city into the rural landscape. And here we're looking at a linocut print from 1952 entitled Coffee Bar, and in many ways perhaps one of the most iconic works that Sybil produced in Campbell River, so very depictive of Campbell River, kind of working man of the, certainly of the 1950s and 1960s, with the plaid shirts, and being just depicted in a local cafe that was in Willow Point, very near where Sybil lived at the time. And we see, again, just a really wonderful kind of jumbled juxtaposition of the figures and the angles, and very very square kind of formal elements to the body. Again, no facial expressions, keeping with Sybil's lack of interest in artifice and ornament and fussiness. Very direct, very solid figures, but really very interesting composition as it recedes from the foreground into the background, with a number of depicting of movements and different shapes, with the hats to the shoulders, to the legs. A very complicated composition, and added more so by the plaid of the shirts. And as I say, a very wonderful depiction of the working man of Campbell River from the 1950s. In the last slide, we looked at Sybil's depiction of the working class culture of Campbell River, and we know she had a great admiration for labor and the working man. And in this slide, we're looking at the depiction of First Nations culture in the Campbell River area. And we also know from Sybil's notes and letters that she had a great respect for local First Nations culture and thought it was very sophisticated. And she had a great admiration for their carvings in particular. She took her students often to the museum at Campbell River to draw the masks in the collection that the museum holds. On the left, we're looking at Indian dance of 1951. And interestingly, we see facial features because we know that Sybil often didn't use or didn't put facial features on her figures, but we do see facial figures here, and it's interesting to see them contrasted kind of underneath the masks that they would be wearing, and of course encloaked in the robes, and very much a sense of the dancer and the regalia and the mask fusing to become one in a very ceremonial kind of presentation. On the right, we're looking at Dance of the Birds from 1975, and again, we see Sybil kind of returning to her very rhythmic, diagonal sense of composition. Again, exquisite use of negative space to just enhance the sense of movement through the composition and through the print. Very beautiful works of Sybil's here. We've seen in Sybil's work over the years the appearance of birds, and usually as an aspect of keeping movement going in the background of a composition, but here they certainly take front and center with a fluttering and a kind of chaos to the kind of frontal surface of the composition, while keeping with her love of the curve and her diagonal foundation to the composition in the background, with the land being plowed and the tractor and the plow with two figures. This was from 1979, and it's entitled Wings, and it is very suggestive of Sybil's home experience from England, but we know it was also inspired from her observations out at Hudson's Farm in Campbell River. And one last note on Wings is that this print was purchased by the Campbell River Arts Council from Sybil in the late 1980s, and was subsequently donated to the Campbell River Art Gallery when the Art Gallery formed in 1995, and the print still remains as part of the permanent collection of the Campbell River Art Gallery. We're looking at a fascinating linocut from 1960 entitled Rock, and just a wonderful fragmentation of the overall composition. We can see with looking closely, a dump truck dumping rocks, and the complexity of the motion in the picture just echoes with the sound of the rocks as they would be clanging and clambering out of the dump. And I had mentioned in Sybil's previous works, especially The Winch of 1930 and Sledgehammers of 1933, how she used the diagonal and used color and composition to suggest sounds in her work. And certainly it comes through in this, what appears at first to be an abstract piece, but in fact is depicting an actual event in Campbell River with the infill of what is now the Tai Plaza in the late 1950s into the 1960s. And this would have been an image that she would have witnessed downtown, with the dump filling in rocks on the shoreline to create that plaza. And just to note, as we continue on, that all of the images we're looking at from Campbell River are part of the collection at the Museum of Campbell River, and were donated to the museum before Sybil's death in the early 1990s. She passed away in 1992 and left over 120 works to the museum before she passed. And what we are looking at in this part 3 are all works that are contained within the museum's collection. We're looking here at a work from 1970 entitled Anno Domini, and it is depicting a snow fence on Hudson's Farm at the north end of Campbell River, and a place that Sybil loved to go and sketch and bring students to draw on the property, and became very close with the Hudson family throughout her time in Campbell River. And a very complex composition as it winds its way from the foreground, and we're looking at a plow in the foreground, but through this cascading snow fence, very complex interrelationship between light and shadow, between positive and negative space, but also punctuated with these cross shapes, or perhaps cruciforms, I suppose they would be called, that suggest a kind of a somber religious reflection, perhaps, but found in a very simple rural farm observation, and a wonderful sense of Sybil's eye as she scans and looks for, as I say, complexity within the landscape and within how objects are arranged and or altered by her, I'm sure, in an attempt to create a composition of contemplation, of reflection, perhaps a meditation on the rhythmic entanglement of forces. It's interesting to see how Sybil, through her use of geometric forms and positive, negative space and compositions, and just love of simplification, she flirts with abstraction, but never totally embraces abstraction. Oftentimes, perhaps just through the titling of her works, we get a suggestion of representation. This is certainly true in the work we're looking at on the left of peavies from 1962. Peavies, of course, are a tool used in logging to keep logs moving downriver in the water, and to just to separate logs out. And of course, from the composition, without knowing the title, we would probably have no clue that that's what she's depicting, but we do get a sense of the use of the logging tool, and of just the motion of being on water, and just the dynamism between, again, these slashing diagonals and their counterpoint and opposition to each other, which of course is what the PV is leveraging in its work. And then on the right, we see Trackway from 1961. We can still, of course, recognize a forest and recognize kind of a logging road through the forest. But just that use of geometric slashing geometry, again, gives a sense of the entanglement of forest. And of course, anyone that's experienced Vancouver Island forests knows the density of them, and can recognize this sense of both horizontal and vertical intersections of all of the trees, and the wind motioning through the trees and the leaves and the branches, and how logging roads just kind of meander and find their way as a path through this entanglement and through this density. And just to continue with her flirtation with abstraction, we're looking on the right at Sails from 1960, and again, without a title to go by, we might not be clear what is going on in this print, but as soon as we hear the word sails, we can start to feel the sense of wind, or the sense of billowing, and the curve as a sail billows, and just a sense of movement all over the piece, just showing kind of shifting winds and how sails adapt to them. Continuing on to Tracks, a later piece from 1977, again without the word tracks. What clue would we have as to what is being depicted in the piece? But as soon as we hear the word, then we perhaps get the sensation of the remnants of an industrial tract, or some kind of machine tract, as it would move through the mud, or move through the soil of a forest, or the plow, or on a farm. Sybil's got a very keen eye and is always looking and roving, spotting in details a sense of the majestic, or just a sense of the exaltation of the small things right alongside the grandeur of the large things. And as we head towards the conclusion of part 3, I did mention earlier I wanted to focus on some of Sybil's other mediums outside linocut, and she certainly left some beautiful woodcuts to the museum in their collection, 2 of which are shown here, and also represent her ability to move between representational and abstraction. We're looking at Douglas firs of 1983 on the left, and Ancient Maple Tree, undated, on the right, and very much looking at the same theme, the gnarliness and the age, and the kind of sense of wisdom in the trunk of a tree and its roots, and just a high sense of respect for an elder of the forest, yet rendered very differently on the right with the Ancient Maple Tree, where geometries and abstractions start to stand in for the detail of the representational work. Sybil could very fluidly move between representation and non-representation, yet, as I say, never totally left representation behind, if only through her titling, not falling into pure abstraction. And Sybil was known to sketch constantly. She reminded her students to always have some kind of a pen and paper handy to be able to just sketch out ideas while they were white hot, as she used to say. And we can sense it in a lot of her watercolors, as we see here, with the first one being an image very much depicted just from her backyard of the ocean and mountains. And we get a sense of just Sybil's stroke with the watercolor, very reflective of the kinds of curves and angles that she would try to achieve believe, in her linocuts. And in the second image, that is watercolor but also with pencil, just note the notations that she's writing all over the composition, just reminding herself of the colors of things and or their shadow, their contrast, that would be memory aids for her when she returned to the studio. And in the last couple of slides, we'll just take a look at some of Sybil's sketches, pencil sketches. She was sketching constantly, sometimes just very quick studies like we're looking at here with men working on a net drum, such as what a gill netter would use. And we see just her return to, in the figures, the studies for the figures, just very quick sketches of trying to depict the geometry of their body form, but also the energy that it takes to work in opposition to kind of the mechanical energy with the tools and the machinery that they're working with. These quick studies just depict a wonderfully lively pencil and eye as it's capturing moments quickly, as she referred to as white hot, to get it down and then to reflect upon it later. And as with her love of labor and agricultural scenes, rural scenes, religious themes, Sybil continued to make architectural renderings of the buildings and barns and lodges within the Campbell River area. And we see here two views of essentially the same building. On the left-hand side is entitled The Old Hospital, which is now the new municipal offices she drew in 1972. And then on the right, entitled Municipal Offices of 1973, the same building, just from two different vantage points. And you can see her traditional art training coming through. She maintained her sense of love of perspective and different viewpoints, light, shadow, all of the things that we saw early on in her career with her dry point etchings, but here just being done much more in a looser, sketchier fashion with pencil. And lastly, the lovely Cape Mudge Light, which is an earlier drawing from 1962. Beautiful sense of sketchiness, yet attention to detail within the lighthouse itself, and a good sense of contrast, light and dark, within the lighthouse, whereas leaving the rest of it somewhat as a sketch and unfinished. But just to note the very quick pencil lines in the sky, giving that kind of vortex and that movement and sense of wind, which is certainly true of the Cape Mudge area. Sybil Andrews was born in 1898 in Bury, St. Edmunds, and she passed away in Campbell River, British Columbia in 1992. She was a very central artist to modernist history, and she continued to teach and refine her art throughout her career. Sybil Andrews maintained a thoughtful search and creative energy all through the 20th century, working in two worlds. Today in Campbell River, the Sybil Andrews Cottage and Walter Morgan Studio are home to the Campbell River Arts Council. The property remains as the only property on the city's heritage registry and is protected. The Arts Council maintains the properties and the buildings as a living testament to the legacy of Sybil Andrews and Walter Morgan.